Welcome to the webinar, Understanding Student Behavior, Factors That Might Explain Why, brought to you by Infinitec. Sam Conklin and myself, Tim Kennedy, will be your hosts. I'm going to introduce Linda Aldridge. She is the owner of LA Learn and a member of the Kansas State Department of Education Technical Assistance Team. And at this point, I'm very excited to turn the controls over to Linda. Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
All righty. Well, welcome, everybody, to the first of a series of 10 webinars. Most of the topics, in fact, all of them, heavily relate to student behavior in schools and home and community, and how paraprofessionals can help kids to navigate some difficult and challenging behaviors. So welcome. It's delightful that we have so many people ready to go this morning from Pennsylvania and Kansas, Illinois, Minnesota, and maybe even some other states. What I'll be doing as we go through is trying to make this presentation as fun and enjoyable and useful as possible. Your time is important to me and to you. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time telling you about who I am or what I've done. If you take a look at this screen, I have a website. If you're interested or curious, go to that website and find out what Linda Aldridge has been up to for the last 30 or 40 years. Good stuff in education, entirely working in education. So I'm a very fortunate person in that respect. Go to my website if you're curious. And also on that website, you're going to find some documents that will explain the sources for the information and content that I will be presenting. I'm presenting in partnership with these amazing Infinitec people. Tim and Sam are two of them. I've just not hit a bad one yet. Infinitec is an incredible organization. In Kansas, like in all of our states, we're struggling to figure out very quickly how to teach children without access to our schools and our classrooms. And in Kansas, a group of amazing educators got together a few weeks ago and in a very, very short number of days put together guidelines for what we're calling continuing education. And the 10th of a series of guidelines really captured my attention and my imagination, and it's on that screen in front of you. Extend grace to all. And I thought, wow, what a powerful thing to share at this point in our nation's history. And so I looked up the definition of the word grace. Turns out there's a bunch of them. But I think the definition most applicable is a disposition to or an act of kindness, courtesy, or clemency. I like those words a lot. So here's the thing. What I invite you all to do for 1 hour is give yourselves the gift of an hour of thinking about your students, your school, how you impact your neighborhood, your community, the kids around you. Just extend yourself and off those other worries out of your mind and think about the positive. And in this case, think about ways that maybe you have extended grace here lately, or you've seen others extend grace. And what I invite you to do is go to your question box during this presentation and type in acts of extending grace, either you have done or you have witnessed. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask Tim and or Sam to pick just a few of those to share with everybody. So we can both begin and end in a positive way and thinking about all the great things going on in our world right now. So extend grace. The learning objectives for today. First of all, you're going to come away in an hour with an understanding of why it is important to know why kids do what they do. Once we have a good guess, we may never know for sure, but when we have a good working hypothesis, a good guess about why kids are doing what they're doing, then the rest of the plan kind of follows. So understanding why we'll be talking about. Factors. There are 6 factors that have been identified, each of which will be discussed, that oftentimes will explain why the child does what he or she does. We're going to talk a little bit about supports, how once we've decided on our best guess of why, we then figure out what kind of supports this child needs. And finally, action, how you as a paraprofessional, how you take action every day to help students and how you might be taking action now, even if your schools are shut down, how you can take action to help those people in your schools who most need your help. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next hour. Alrighty, there is a download. Tim mentioned factors related to function of behavior. Now here's the thing. If you haven't downloaded it yet, don't panic. Use this precious time while we're together in this webinar to think, to ponder, to be engaged. Don't be frantically worrying about downloads at the moment. You're going to want those documents after the presentation, or if you have it with you right now, that is good. But if you haven't yet downloaded, just wait until after and go ahead and download, because I'll be explaining terms as we go. And your learning time will be best used if you're engaged in what we're talking about right now, rather than worrying about a download. But the download you're going to want later on. Okay, why we need to know why, the first of our 4 learning objectives. When you understand why a student is behaving as he or she does, you're more likely to be empathetic. We've all had that moment where we've been frustrated or tired of working with a child, and then we get a glimpse into that child or that youth's frame of mind, where they're coming from, and all of a sudden we can understand. When we understand, we're more likely to be coming across with compassion and respect. We're going to be more effective teachers. By the way, I'll tend to use the word teacher and para interchangeably because, let's face it, paraprofessionals, you are all teachers. When you walk into that school as an adult in charge, you are a teacher. So there you go. Empathy is important. Secondly, we need to know why a student does what he or she does so we can put the proper supports in place. The reason why a kid is doing what he does relates directly to the kind of supports they need. For example, if a student is lashing out in an angry way, but the reason behind it has to do with a lack of communication, student can't tell you what they need, the support's going to be finding alternative ways for that student to communicate. If the student is lashing out because the work they're being asked to do is too hard and they're frustrated, the support is going to have to do with changing the kind of instruction or what we're teaching the student. Does that make sense? I hope so. We'll be talking more about matching supports to factors. And then the third reason why we need to know why has to do with plan revisions. As you work as a part of a team, and we'll talk more about teamwork too, as the para works as part of a team, so often the para is central to knowing what's going on with that child at that moment, that hour, that day. The para is often in the best position to give information, data that informs the plan, and we make revisions either in our guess about the factors influencing behavior or the kinds of supports that we put into place. So the paraprofessional oftentimes is in that front row spot to help with plan revisions. So there you go. This is why we need to understand why the student does what he does. Okay, now periodically we're going to have poll questions. And this is your opportunity to think and to move. If you're sitting for an entire hour, this is the time to get up, do a jumping jack, pet the cat, go talk to the husband or whoever else might be around. But you only have like 10 seconds to do it. I'm serious. I have a stopwatch, okay? During the poll question times, I want you to move, stand up, do a jumping jack, touch your toes, something, and answer the question. And you can do that via the question box. And Tim will be helping me to know who is responding. So there's your poll question. And it's an interesting one. I've used this question a lot with teachers, with paraprofessionals, with administrators. True or false? It is okay if occasionally you do not like a student. Now, go ahead and respond. 5, 10 seconds at most. Get an answer in there using your question box. And then we're going to talk about the responses. 74% say true, 26% say false. So 74% think it's okay if occasionally you do not like a student. That's fascinating. And it's not unusual that I get that kind of a response to that question. So let me first thank you for responding. That's important, very important. And secondly, I want you to think about that a little bit. You need to pay attention to your own thoughts and emotions and your social connectedness to every single student individually. And it's certainly true, at times there will be a kid who does something you don't like. But also think about the fact that the students who need you the most are the ones who are most likely to behave the worst and to do things that are in fact quite unlikable. So what I invite you to do, and also remember, if you don't like the kid, she's going to know it. So how do you kind of work through this? If you're knowing, you're paying attention to your own thoughts and emotions, and you know, you're just not too happy with this kid. What I invite you to do is really work at those relationships with students. Really find ways, reach out, try to understand where they're coming from, and find things that are likable. Build a relationship. The tougher the kid, the harder it is to build that relationship, and the more important it is to find ways and reasons to like that student. So think so much about your power and how you interact with those students out there. Okay, we're going to dive in now to the 6 factors. Once again, don't worry, this slide has more words on it than most, and that's okay. Each one of those factors will be discussed separately. And also in the handout, there's a nice description of each of these factors. So again, don't worry if you're not totally grasping everything in this particular presentation. You can go back and think and reflect and say, that makes sense and that one doesn't. That's all right. But we're going to be talking about each one of these, starting with biological regulation. Now, in biological regulation, think about a couple of things, basic things, like has a student had enough food, the right kinds of food? Does this student have access to medical care that could help? Does the student have a toothache? It's really hard to learn to read if your tooth is aching. Is the student getting enough sleep? Are you dealing with sleep deprivation? Think a lot about neurological issues. Those neurologists, those neuroscientists, they're having all the fun these days in figuring out how our brains work. And increasingly, what we're finding is that all kinds of neurological conditions, think anxiety, stress, trauma, depression, ADHD, all of those things actually involve brain functioning, actual structure of the brain, biologically, how our brain is working. Think about medication issues. We are not physicians. We do not diagnose or prescribe medication, nor do we want to. And I would even say never, almost never, be encouraging parents to think about medical issues that's simply beyond the scope of the expertise of educators. On the other hand, if medical professionals have diagnosed and prescribed medication, we can do a lot as educators to find out if they're getting the right meds, if those medications are making a difference. We can look at medication issues with respect to how a child is behaving in school and provide amazing information to help change lives. This will be one of many times where I'll be talking about partnership with our mental health facilities. If we suspect that there might be something going on where we need to partner with our medical people or with our mental health people, you as a paraprofessional so often will be one of the first to pick up on it. So biological regulation has to do with physical things happening in our bodies, to include brain functioning, which includes all kinds of psychological and neurological conditions. Think about movement. One of the reasons for each poll question, I'm saying you need to move, even in the space of a 1-hour webinar, is because movement is essential to learning. If some students are having troubles learning, they may not be moving enough. They may not be getting enough exercise. In schools, those physical education teachers have more and more to do with best educational practices. How do we help kids to be physically fit? That affects brain functioning. That affects a child's ability to do well in school. So the first of those is biological regulation. Now I'm going to insert a word about trauma right here. Trauma affects how brains develop. What I mean is brains work differently, look differently, develop differently when developed in response to trauma. So oftentimes we're working with children who have some very serious behavioral issues, even aggressive behaviors, sometimes behaviors you might even feel a little bit afraid of, okay? If we don't know for sure, think about the possibility of trauma. That would be one possibility within biological regulation. Understand, traumatized students may not know themselves why they're doing what they're doing. And they may be responding to implicit memories. That is, memories associated so deeply in their brain development with circumstances that they don't consciously remember. So some students may be behaving in ways that they never themselves will totally understand why. Once again, those mental health partnerships are critical. And also understand that when we're working with trauma, students who've been traumatized, too many words closing in on students, trying to access the prefrontal cortex may be something that is difficult or impossible for the child to do. So it could be the kinds of supports we put into place if we suspect trauma or know a student has dealt with traumatic circumstances, really need to be carefully thought out. It could be in traumatized situations that the only support a student can really tolerate or understand is becoming calm, feeling what it means to become calm, feeling what it means to be around a trusted adult who could well be the paraprofessional. So think about trauma as one part of biological regulation, one possibility. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is so important, especially in these times. Who would have thought that even 2 months ago, we would be in the midst of a worldwide pandemic? Social connectedness is critical to learning. So another factor to think about is social connectedness. If you suspect that social connectedness issues are associated with a student's misbehavior, here are some questions to ponder. Does this child have a friend? Does this youth trust at least one adult in the school or in the community or at home? Now, these are really good questions, and one thing you can do is simply ask the child or the youth, do you have a friend here at school? Now, sometimes a child where you're pretty sure there are no friends will say, oh yeah, I've got lots of friends. You've got to listen carefully, not only to what they say in words, but what their bodies are telling you, what their facial expressions are telling you. And so often, once again, it's going to be that paraprofessional who is in the right spot, who really knows what's going on and social with a particular child. If social connectedness is an issue, then supports might be things like helping that student to make friends. A support might be helping that student to develop a trust relationship with at least one person at school. And so often that one person might be the paraprofessional. And those relationships need to be structured, consciously put together. And don't leave it to chance. It's too important. So social connectedness is another factor to think about. Okay, the next poll question is coming up. Look at that kid. That looks like a fun thing. They're doing some sort of science with microscopes. Why is that child apparently sleeping in class? So, A, could it be biological regulation issues? Something going on with sleep deprivation or medication or something? Could it be social connectedness? Does that student have friendship issues or doesn't trust the teacher? Or could it be both? Go ahead and once again, 5 to 10 seconds, go to that question box and enter your response. A, B, or C. I've got my stopwatch going again. So don't take a long time and move. Stand up, sit down, touch your toes. Be nice to the cat. Oh, look at this. 85% think it could be one or the other or maybe both. And that's what I'd go with too. Here's the thing about these factors, and you guys are smart. You picked up exactly what I was hoping you'd pick up on. These factors we're talking about are interrelated, right? Sometimes it could be very difficult to fish out which it might be. Simply going by the picture of this child is not enough information. And guess what? Who is often in that front row spot and might know enough about that child to guess one way or the other what's going on with that kid? Well, it's you, the paraprofessional. Yeah, a lot of times you're going to be able to flush this out and say, I know for a fact he came in looking really tired, and I happen to know that Uncle Herbie moved in, and so Uncle Herbie's taken that child's bed, and this kid's sleeping on the sofa right in front of the TV that's on until 2 or 3 in the morning because he's got a cousin who really likes to play video games, okay? We don't know. But oftentimes a para is going to pick up on the information that will help us to understand what support needs to be in place based upon what factor is at play. So once again, the para can be the key person in the life of that child. The picture isn't enough information, and you guys saw that right away. Excellent. Okay, moving on. Okay, so the next factor we're going to talk about is emotional regulation. Our schools are just brimming these days with emotional regulation curricula, information, zones of regulation, those kinds of things. I'm not here to promote any particular set of materials to be used in schools. I just know they're out there. Emotional regulation has to do with the child's ability to be able to understand within him or herself what emotions are going on and how to think about those emotions and how to respond appropriately, knowing how I personally feel as a student or a youth. It also has to do with being able to read the emotions of others, of taking a look at the person next to you and understanding how that person might be feeling. Some states have a social, emotional, and character curricula. Some do not. It varies a little bit across the nation. But pay attention to emotional regulation. If a student oftentimes is displaying emotions that seem it doesn't make sense given the social circumstances of the moment, emotional regulation might be an issue. If the student is misreading the emotions of others, for example, I was working with a student just a few weeks ago, back when the schools were still open, and the student looked at me and said, "Why are you angry with me?" I said, "Well, I'm not." I really needed to think about what was going on my face and in my body that might have prompted that student to think I was angry when I was not, and to be very clear with the student about what's going on with my own emotionality. Something else to think about in emotional regulation is your own emotional regulation issues. If you start to feel angry with a student, you're not the right person at that moment to be effective. And let me tell you, the kids we're talking about here, they know how to push our buttons. So if you feel like you're starting to be frustrated or angry or stressed in working with a kid, find out if there's a way you can have a way in your system, your school, to tap out, to look to another adult to say, "Could you step in here a minute? I need a moment." And oftentimes it's really just a few seconds or maybe a minute that you need to get in touch with how you're feeling to make sure you can be appropriate with that kid. So emotional regulation is another factor that can oftentimes relate to behavioral issues in school. My button worked. Okay, next factor, curriculum and instruction. I especially love this one because this is what we do in schools. We know what to teach and we know how to teach it. I've been working in schools since 1983 when we started with this huge movement of being accountable in terms of student outcomes. And nationwide, there's been all kinds of things going on, leave no child behind and all that kind of stuff. But here's what we know for sure. What we teach is what is most likely going to be learned. Imagine that. So access to curriculum and instruction is absolutely essential. Every child deserves access to learning opportunities that are rigorous for that child and of interest, of relevance to that child. If we're asking a kid to learn something that's boring or irrelevant in their lives, don't be too surprised if they tune out. Depending on the kid, some might tune out concurrent with some pretty interesting behaviors. So one of the things we always want to check on is how are we doing with teaching and learning? Are we teaching the right stuff? Are we teaching in ways that make sense to that kid? Special education, if you are a special educator, and many paraprofessionals are, has to do with a presentation of specialized instruction in order to make sure kids can learn what everybody else is learning, what we would call the general education curriculum. So as a paraprofessional, oftentimes you're right out there delivering the specialized instruction. Is it working? Is what you're doing really relevant to that child? Is what you're doing really helping the kid to grasp, given their circumstances and to the extent possible, what's happening in science class or math class or in fourth grade social studies or in first grade as they're learning to read? Paraprofessionals usually are one of the first to know if the curriculum being presented is sufficiently relevant and rigorous given what that child needs. So this is a huge one. Now, once again, think supports. If we think the problem is that the work is too hard or too easy, either one, oftentimes a parent is going to know. And one of the supports we might want to think about is changing what we're teaching or how we're teaching. I know this sounds simplistic, but so often we miss this one in schools, and this should be the one we're the best at. So curriculum and instruction. If that's a factor at play, then we need to look carefully at what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. All righty, moving on.
Can we take a quick break? Can we take a quick break for a couple questions?
Sure.
Mary asked, what if you're working with nonverbal children? How can you ask them those questions that you presented earlier? What would your
What
suggestion?
if you're working with what?
Nonverbal children.
Nonverbal children. Excellent question. And we're getting to this next factor, which is perfect. Mary, you're brilliant, because what you're linking to in terms of what we teach and how we teach can oftentimes directly be influenced by the child's communication skills. So I think the question has to do with nonverbal, right? A child who is unable to use language to express themselves. And sometimes it's receptive and expressive vocabulary or skills. Sometimes they might be taking things in, but they can't say it back out to us. Sometimes, and we're never quite sure, maybe they're not understanding receptive language is impacted as well as expressive language. So in those kinds of situations, your speech language pathologists, SLPs, oftentimes will have alternative ways to teach that child to communicate. It might be some kind of pictures. It could be based on a computer or an iPad system, or it might be those little pictures that we put in front of the child and give choice boards. It could be those buttons we teach them to press if they need to go to the bathroom or if they are hungry, so that they can communicate. Kids with a very limited or completely nonverbal vocabulary, boy, we've got to be able to read their body language. We've got to get to know them. Our relationship, the social connectedness factor with those kids is more important because we have to look at the nonverbal cues the child is giving us about what they need. Mary, I hope that answered your most excellent question. Tim, was there another one?
I don't know if you want to address this now, but what about children who have sociopathic tendencies? Like a psychologist may be able to figure out the behaviors of these kids, but how should paras and teachers adjust?
Did you say sociopathic?
Yes.
Boy, that is a heavy-duty word. Yes, we're going to want, to the extent that we can, mental health professionals involved. Now, here's the thing. This is a movement across the country, not just in Kansas, where schools and mental health people are trying to figure out how to partner with one another, how to talk to one another. We got two sets of bureaucratic expectations, funding sources, how they operate, how schools operate, and we're trying to figure out how to communicate with one another. So this is not always easy, but for sure your mental health people need accurate information coming from the schools and vice versa. And the labels that we place on kids, both through mental health professionals and through our schooling, can be extraordinarily harmful and or extraordinarily helpful in understanding how to help a child. And especially if we're dealing with violent or highly aggressive behaviors or behaviors that make us feel afraid or worried for the safety of other kids or our colleagues, those kinds of behaviors also, we need to be thinking about safety all the time. And that plan that I referenced, this piece we're talking about today, understanding why a child behaves the way he does, is just a beginning piece in understanding how to put together plans where adults work as a team to help kids. So when we're talking about some pretty deep-seated psychological or social conditions, hopefully we're getting mental health involved. Remember those experts within our schools, the counselors, the social workers, school psychologists. We're going to want them at the table trying to figure out how to keep everyone safe while we're helping that child to learn to read, to write, to do math, all of those kinds of things. It's not an easy question, but a good one. What else you got, Tim?
With HIPAA, how much are paras allowed to know with respect to some health issues that drive behavior?
Yeah, let's talk confidentiality. Excellent question. We need to make sure that what we're talking about is kept confidential within the school team and within the school on a need-to-know basis. HIPAA, especially if we have written parental consent, and that's a really important thing, can allow team members to talk with one another. And I so strongly urge these team members to include paras on those teams, because oftentimes the para needs to know what's going on with this child. So consider written parental consent to share information across team members and even across social agencies like our mental health professionals. If you are privy to that information via written parental consent and within your school and your district and your state laws and policies, make sure as a para you are maintaining confidentiality. These are not stories you take home to your friends and neighbors and your kid and your cat and your husband. These are stories that you leave at school because confidentiality is essential. So I would turn to your local policies, your supervising teacher, your principal, to find out to what extent you can and should have access to confidential information. And then remember your personal responsibility to respect those confidentiality guidelines. Kim, any others at the moment?
No, the rest I'll save until the end.
All righty, let's move on to the next factor. And we've already touched on it a bit thanks to these excellent questions. Communication skills. Those speech language pathologists are on this. Man, they're the oldest branch of special ed. Did you know that? Speech language pathologists. They know how to get in, how to diagnose issues, how to provide the right kinds of therapy, and then how to get out. They're marvelous. And they're oftentimes the people who are going to be able to help us to know what's going on with the communication issues with a child, especially if the child is receiving special education services. So often communication skills relate directly to what we've also already talked about, social connectedness. If you're miscuing on communication, if I'm hearing somebody say something and I think I've just been insulted or put down or disrespected, my response may not look too good. If, on the other hand, I'm understanding the social nuances, both of verbal and nonverbal communication, as a participant in school or in home or in community, I'm much more likely to be behaving in ways that make sense to other people. So social connectedness is critical, and communication skills are directly related. If a child does not have a strong working vocabulary, we're going to have to work harder to figure out how to understand what that child needs and to help that child to express their direction, their communications and their needs to us. Take a look at those pictures. I couldn't resist a photo at this point in our circumstances of a bunch of 3 children wearing face masks. Think too about how all of this social distancing is affecting communication in our homes, in our communities, in our capacity to help our children right now. Communication skills are more important to think about now than ever before. Okay, moving on. Here's a poll question to see how you guys, if you're still with me, if you're still interested, if you're still participating. And this relates directly to, I think it was Mary, her question. We've got a kid with autism, expressive vocabulary of only 40 or 50 words. And several times a day, 4 or 5 times a day, this child gets really angry and makes angry sounds and actually strikes out at the adult nearest her. How could we best explain these behaviors? Emotional regulation, access to curriculum, communication skills. What do you think? What might be going on with this child? 10 seconds, got my stopwatch going. Put in your answer in the question box and move. Remember to move. All righty, what's it looking like, Tim? Oh, look at that, 75% thinking communication, 22% emotional regulation, 3% access to curriculum and instruction. All righty, and you know, any one of those could potentially be right. And I think given our most recent discussion in this webinar, it makes sense that you're leaning towards 75%, especially since I didn't give you an option of 1 or more. And of course, it could be any one of those 3, depending on other information that we have. Given our most recent discussion, Communication skills could well be it. What if this child needs to go to the bathroom right now? What if this child is hungry? What if some other kid in the classroom made fun of this child and that child's angry about that? I don't know. 4 to 5 times a day, all kinds of things could be happening that could push this particular kid to become more aggressive and angry about things. I sometimes try to wonder what it would be like if I'm in school and I have a basic need, or maybe the work's just irritating me because it's irrelevant to what I want to learn today. I don't know. And I cannot express those kinds of issues. I could very quickly become frustrating. So good response. I'm glad you guys are hanging in there with me and thinking. And for 75% of you to be leaning toward communication makes total sense. Remember, to know for sure, we need data, we need observation, we need those paras on the front line making their best guesses about what's going on with that child. All right, so moving on then, cultural environmental skills. Here's one to think about carefully. This is where the child simply does not know how to behave. And sometimes we assume that a kid knows how to walk in a hallway or how to behave in the lunchroom or how to behave on the bus. And when they misbehave, we jump right to punishments and consequences of other sorts and things. And we forget that maybe the child has not yet learned or totally understood how to consistently navigate his environment in the school, at home, or in the community. That child or that youth really doesn't know. The picture, for example, of the kid, and I don't know if that food's going in or coming out, but you get my meaning here? Sometimes children, well, if you've spent any time at all in an elementary school lunchroom, you can see all kinds of kids talking with their mouths open and things. But maybe this child needs to be reminded of how to eat appropriately when around others, or maybe he got sick. I don't know. But I want you to think about how we teach character education, how we teach social skills to kids, how we teach common area expectations. And this is where the para's role is absolutely critical, because in the common areas in our schools, like lunchroom, before school, after school, bus behavior, hallway behavior, we need consistent expectations that are taught and modeled by every adult in the school. And when we think about paraprofessionals as team members, not only in special education, but in the school as a whole, paras are in a unique and wonderful place to teach and model those environmental skills that all kids need, and that kids with unique needs, sometimes kids in special education receiving those IEP services, those kids especially need explicit instruction about how to behave in these circumstances as they move throughout their schooling day. So, paraprofessionals, make sure that to the extent that your school is understanding the need for consistent work in this area, make sure you are teaching and modeling those expectations in a way that are consistent with how the other adults are teaching and modeling. You are in a powerful position. In some states, we might call this positive behavioral intervention supports, or MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports. It can be called different things in different states, but usually what it boils down to is ways to positively impact the behavior of students by teaching and modeling what we expect them to do. So again, this might be social skills instruction, like how to follow instructions or how to accept criticism. It might be character education, like how to be a friend, how to show empathy. It could be those very, very direct ideas and expectations about how you behave in the lunchroom, how you walk in the hallway. So often our kids who are most fragile, who have the greatest problems with behavior in school, are also the ones who need the most instruction. They need lots of opportunity to practice those expectations before it becomes second nature to them. So cultural environmental skills, very important. All righty, here's a poll question. We got a kid hanging on a fence. Okay, now in this case, let's say you're a part of a support team for this child, and it's already been decided that this kid needs a lot of support with cultural environmental skills. That is explicit teaching of expectations, modeling of expectations, helping and guiding that child to behave appropriately based upon expectations in the school. So what do you think? You've already decided the factor is cultural environmental skills. We find the kid hanging from the fence. What does that child need most right now? Some help with playground rules? Should we teach them better escape strategies? How about foot apparel? I'm a little worried about those little bare toes. You've got 10 seconds. Please, in your question box, log in your response, A, B, or C.
91% say playground rules, 6% say escape strategies, and 3% say appropriate foot apparel.
I think that maybe 6% of our webinar participants have a very good sense of humor. A sense of humor that might match mine, by the way. Yeah, maybe teach them escape strategies, but maybe this kid more likely needs some explicit expectations that are taught and modeled regarding playground rules. And I am worried about that foot apparel thing. Those bare toes could get tangled in that fence and be badly hurt if he falls over backward. I know we mothers and teachers and paras, we always think the worst, but I smile to think about the escape strategies also. So yeah, teaching and modeling those playground rules are really important in situations like this. All righty, moving on. Now we're going to move on to the next of our learning objectives. We've talked about this throughout the discussion of each of the 6 factors. This is matching supports to factors. Once we have our best guess at why the student is doing what he or she does, which factor seems most at play, then we can understand what kind of supports need to be put into play. And I want to emphasize something here. Supports can be consequences of various sorts. We definitely want to avoid punishment, because punishment comes with a whole slew of unanticipated and not good outcomes for children and youth and for the adults around them. But my gosh, we need consequences or supports that really help to address the factor. And I want to just hit again, if we suspect trauma, if mental health partnerships are involved, if a student has overreacted in ways that might be a really extreme disruption to his learning or the learning of other people around him, please understand that sometimes the only consequence or support that's going to make sense to that child for a very long time is learning how to become calm within the relationship with a trusted adult. It might be the paraprofessional who's comforting that child, helping him or her to understand, I've been really upset and now I'm feeling calm again. Trust, calm, learning what that feels over and over and over within that trust relationship. Then there's a whole bunch of other things we can think about in terms of supports, and we're going to discuss a little bit more. The child who is falling asleep maybe needs nap time at school. And that's a little easier sell in elementary school than it is in high school. But, you know, the fact is, if we're dealing with a sleep-deprived child or youth, they're probably not going to learn much until that need is met. So matching the support, it might be a nap time or a place for the child to sleep. The ADHD child might need medication. We work with our mental health and our physicians, and if they have a diagnosis and they prescribe medication, maybe we can make sure that medication's getting where it needs in a timely way if we can look at the schedule and with the physician's support and agreement, time the medication to be distributed at school. If the schoolwork is too hard or too easy, then maybe that's where we need to make the adjustments, because wow, those things are all within the direct control of the school people. So matching supports to factors is critical. I'm going to hit this point pretty hard because there is research out there that is quite fascinating about why oftentimes the support or behavior plans we put into effect for children, why those plans fail. One of the leading reasons for plan failure is because a plan never addressed the real needs of the child. We put supports into place that had to do with things we've already got there, check in, check out, or an anger management group or something like that, but we never really got to the factor most influencing this child's behavior. So we want those supports to be directly related to the factor or factors we think are at play. And you might say, well, come on, Linda, there could be all 6 of them at work with a particular kid at a particular moment. That is correct. But what the team needs to do, and having that para as part of that team, is figure out what one or two factors most are affecting the behaviors that most need to be worked on. That is, what behaviors are most impeding the child's ability to learn and work and grow in school. Tackle those behaviors first and tackle the factors related to those behaviors as best you can. So matching the support to the factor is critical. We're going to be talking a little bit more about data at a subsequent webinar, but for now know that the data that paras can compile regarding the effectiveness of supports is critical, because if we've got the right support and the right factor, we should be seeing changes, positive changes in student behavior. If we're not seeing positive changes, or if things are getting worse, we got to go back to the drawing board. Think about the factors we've chosen. Think about the supports we've chosen. Maybe we need to work at it and try different things. And we keep on trying until we figure it out. Okay, a poll question. Remember to be moving on these poll questions, not just pushing a button, get up and move. Here we got something going on. Looks like a high school situation. And it looks like at least one member of this group of 4 young women is not happy. But remember too, those other 3, even if they've got smiles on their faces, they may not be happy either. So what do you think? What's the best response? And remember, you got 10 seconds. Do we want to promote social distancing? Boy, those are words that I hadn't thought about much prior to about 6 weeks ago. What do we think? Do we want to suggest that that student eats alone? Or do we want to teach strategies for being a good friend? And who do we want to target for all this instruction? There are several young people in that picture. So, clock's ticking, enter your response and move. All right, and survey says, Tim, 98% teaching strategies for being a good friend. Yeah, that's the one I'd go with. I try not to get too clever on these things. So social distancing, probably not. If they're eating in the cafeterias, probably before we got into all of this quarantining 6-foot distance stuff. Likewise, eating alone could be something temporarily to give them all a little bit of a break and to think about what's going on here. But ultimately, teaching strategies to be a good friend. Those kinds of social skills look a lot different if you're working with a 6-year-old than a 16-year-old. But you definitely can be teaching these strategies to all children and youth in all grade levels in our schools. And remember about modeling. Model how to be a good friend along with teaching strategies, and encourage and support. And remember too that those 3 girls that might be making fun of or socially putting down the other girl, remember that they need help too. Because what's going on? If this is an ongoing thing, it could even be bullying. But the bully, that is a heavy duty label also that can be very harmful. If we approach this as a teaching opportunity for all youth involved, it's more likely we're going to have good outcomes. So yeah, I would go with social skills there. And that would be in, when you think about the factor, that would be probably either social connectedness or cultural environmental skills, where we're trying to teach how to be a good friend. That would be my best guess also. All righty, a word about data. Data are so important. What we gather, how we gather it, how we ensure accuracy in data. Because think about how we put together these support plans. We get a bunch of caring adults together that hopefully will include the paraprofessional, along with people who love this child, the adult or the guardian of the child, school people. We have a team working on behalf of the child. We decide what our best guess is regarding the reason the child is doing what he's doing, and we put supports in place. We don't know if those supports are effective until we've gathered data. And guess what? That paraprofessional, you, the person who's listening right now, is so often in the best place to gather the best data about how things are actually working. This is so important that we have a whole separate webinar coming up on April 17th, just about data management, adult accountability, and the power of what I call meatbacks. So get that April 17th on your calendar and just know that that data piece is critical. Moving on. A little bit about teamwork. Paraprofessionals, I would say the same thing to you that I would to principals or teachers or parents. Work as a team. Paras, I'll bet you're brimming with excellent ideas about how to help right now during the pandemic response, what you could be doing right now, and what you can be doing when schools are open again. And hopefully that won't be too awfully long, but what you can do personally. But remember, when you're taking action, you're part of the team. So you got a great idea, but yeah, run it by your supervising teacher, run it by the principal. Make sure that the action you're thinking about is in keeping with your state and local policies and practices, and is in keeping with the plan for that child. You are one of a member of a team, and we're tackling the tough issues here. So make sure nobody goes it alone. Be a good team member. Okay, taking action, collegial relationships. How are you doing in your social connectedness with your peers, with other paras, with other people within your school? Not just teachers and the principal. What about the janitors and the custodians, the administrative support people, the people who work in the lunchroom, the bus drivers? How are you doing with your relationships with those people? Sometimes some people aren't that easy to get along with. So build those relationships. Remember that extend grace thing? Right now, everybody is under some unusual stresses. So really think about how you can build your collegial relationships with other people, always, but especially now. Another thing about taking action, someone mentioned a pretty serious label. If we're dealing with a child who has a label of one sort or another, or whose behavior would indicate that there could be danger to that child hurting his or herself, or that child hurting other kids or adults around him or her, think about safety. Again, taking action. If volatile or dangerous, you want to make sure that the plan includes safety for that student and for everyone else around. And never hesitate to report things that you think are unsafe. Report to your supervising teacher, report to your principal. Sometimes email can be a good way to report, because then your thoughts are not only personal but in writing. But also do that face-to-face verbal reporting anytime you think safety is at risk for anyone in your school. What can paras do? You can send notes or emails. You can do all kinds of things to help kids at this time. You can be waving at kids as parts of car parades I've seen going on. You can be the one who's checking on your neighbors or keeping that 6-foot distance. You can do all kinds of things, but do it as part of a team within keeping in terms of what's going on with the plan for your students now during this pandemic response, but also when things start to normalize again. Take action as part of the team. Okay, at the very beginning, we talked about this notion of extending grace to all. Tim, do you have any examples of extending grace you think are especially worthy of sharing in our few minutes that we still have here?
Says extending grace contributed to supplying lunch to the ER workers at the local hospital.
Yeah.
A lot of them about lunch, helping students get their lunch, grocery shopping, cooking with elderly neighbors.
Yep.
Yeah, and then some of them just checking in, sending email to students,
yep.
helping elderly people.
Yes.
Yeah.
So many ways that paraprofessionals can contribute with their school community and their general community. And of course, we're all worried about our family members. Extending grace. And boy, the paras that I've known and loved over the years sometimes have the biggest hearts of anybody. So good that you're thinking about those things. Other questions that we need to deal with before we close out in our last couple of minutes. Tim?
Yeah, I'm trying to group them. I've got quite a few questions, but they tend to be grouped. One of them that came up a lot was how much information should paras have? It goes back to that confidentiality. Teachers aren't sharing information with paras. Should paras be included in the IEP meetings? Those kinds of things.
Okay, I'm gonna respond in a very biased fashion here. So this is B for bias, if I could put that on my forehead right now. My bias as a former teacher, special ed and gen ed, and as a school principal and in various district level positions over the years, is that teachers or paraprofessionals needs to be as much informed as possible, especially when safety is involved. And by that, I have liked to bring paras to the table to be a part of the planning process and the data management on an ongoing basis. Why? Because oftentimes paras are the ones who know the most about the kid and have the best relationships with that child. Those IEPs, once again, with parental permission, can be shared with paras. The learning goals that are built into IEPs, when I was a special ed teacher, I could not have done progress monitoring without the paras feeding me data about what's going on with the child with respect to a particular learning goal. So some schools understand this better than others. Paras, if you're in one of those schools where you feel like you've been marginalized, where your power is not being properly used, extend grace first and foremost, but also be quietly persistent. Be the person out there saying, you know what, I've got some really good information and here it is. Or, you know what, I could take over counting the number of hits or punches per episode. Or, you know what, I can look at that learning goal and tell you some information about what that child's sight vocabulary is right now. Be persistent, quietly, just on the edge there, feeding them that information and waiting for them to wake up and see your power. Don't add to the stress of your supervising teachers and principals, especially right now, but be there for them in a positive way. And sooner or later, they're going to say, wow, this para has a lot to offer. So hang in there. And if you have already been responded to and are already a trusted member of the team, share that information with other paras, other principals, other supervising teachers. Paras have tremendous power when they use it appropriately. What else you got, Tim?
The other group of questions revolved around things that happen at home, whether it's a cultural thing at home or parents are disengaged with their children or non-existent. How do you deal with behaviors that stem from those things that are out of their control?
Yeah. First of all, let's remember that a lot of things happening in home and community are also out of the control of the student. And especially as we deal with older students, and I'm not talking like just middle and high, even older elementary students often take on adult level worries. And I can't even imagine at this point in time, if you're living in a home where the adults themselves have some pretty serious issues, and you're a child that might be 8, 10 years old or 15 or 16, and you're worried about things like getting food to younger siblings or a baby who needs a diaper change or whatever. So these things that we worry about and think we can't control at home or community, that's correct, but neither can the student we're worried about. When so many of you responded in extending grace about being available and helping with making sure children in this time especially are getting their school lunches and breakfasts, their meals, that is critical. You guys know better than many what these kids are dealing with. So when I hear the questions about home and community, I go back to relationships. Wherever you can, try not to be judgmental and instead extend a listening ear. Extend the capacity to have a relationship with that parent, with that adult that is in that child's life. Consider how to impact home and community through agencies like church groups, mental health groups, city rec programs, other adults within the community that might be more stable. Understand that right now we are in an unprecedented time. And so the way we're going about communicating support and building relationships is different than anything I've ever seen before. A week ago, I had not considered doing webinars, okay? So we're all figuring this out together. So let's learn together now, and when the situation normalizes, and people, we will get through this. This pandemic will not go on forever. We'll get to the other side. Let's remember all these things we're learning right now and continue to apply, but also remember when we get back to the place where we can hug and do handshakes and look people in the eye close up. Remember how important all of that is in building and maintaining relationships with those home people and those community people. I ramble a bit, Tim. Questions are dangerous for me. What else do you have?
Well, that's okay. Another group of questions was around the teacher-para relationship. What if there's differences in their expectations and their level of caring and those kinds of things?
Yeah. And, across the nation, there's a shortage of special ed teachers. And so sometimes a supervising teacher within special ed might be someone who's very, very new to the profession. And the para might be highly skilled and highly experienced. Oh my, there's a recipe for difficulties in developing good working relationships, right? So I ask of paras, extend grace to those teachers that are finding their way, that might be new to the profession and don't yet understand how critical it is to build good working relationships with a team of paraprofessionals. And be the voice, be the person on that team that is helping and supporting and building strong relationships, even if the supervising teacher maybe isn't yet quite up to the task, if you're understanding what I say here. Be that para that continues to stay strong and positive and keep the focus on the child and the youth, on the learning objectives that need to occur. And also remember the power of data. Keep feeding that person data about what's going on. And these might be carefully written anecdotal responses or descriptions of a student outburst, or it might be counting inappropriate behaviors, or it might be describing the learning outcomes of a lesson. Keep them brief, write them down if you can. Anything involving safety, give immediately in verbal form as well as written form, and keep feeding that information to them. Be the best support you can be for that teacher as that teacher is figuring out his or her job.
All right, I have one more kind of group of questions, and then I think we'll have to end it after that. What is best practices for paras communicating with parents? Like where should their boundaries be?
Yeah, talk to your supervising teacher about this one. Sometimes we're working with paras who themselves are highly stressed or have some pretty serious communications issues. Sometimes a para might be the person who is best friends with the parent, or backyard neighbors with the parent, or the parent lives right down the street, or you see that parent all the time at the laundromat or the grocery store, back in the good old days when we were going out, remember. And we'll get back to laundromats and supermarkets again. But be careful, because we want to be consistent as a team. Remember, you're not working in isolation. So if you're saying one thing to a parent and the supervising teacher or the principal is saying something else, the parent might start to worry that as a team, you don't know what you're doing. So make sure that what you're saying and communicating and how you're communicating it is professional and consistent with that of the teammates. Sometimes I've seen situations where the para has the best relationship with the parent, and so that para is put in charge of being the primary communicator, and everybody feeds information to the para. In other situations, that primary communicator might be the teacher, might be the principal, it might be the school secretary who really connects with this parent. So sometimes we've got to be very careful and very strategic about communication. Find out what your team is doing, and at very least do no harm. Be careful. Your words have power.
Okay, there were some questions that did not get answered, and I apologize, but I do think we are out of time. I do want to mention that this webinar is being recorded, and you will get a follow-up email on how to access that recording. Please share this with your colleagues. Because these webinars are full and some of the upcoming ones are full, we are opening up extra sessions, so there will be repeats if you want to watch live so you can get credit. So just look for that communication from Infinitec on when those are and how to get access to the recordings and the slides for this presentation. Linda, there were lots and lots and lots of comments about how people appreciate that you are doing these for them, for the paraprofessionals, and how they get overlooked many times. And I just want to reiterate that, having been a former teacher, appreciating your paraprofessionals is very, very important in having a good relationship for the best outcomes for the students. So Linda, thank you for all of this and on behalf of everybody that commented on that. Linda, thank you so much. It was wonderful. I really appreciate your time. And for those of you who are looking forward to this series, we'll see you for the next webinar. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy.